I wonder if you could just tell me exactly what an interview is. Isn't it just a conversation between two people?
In many ways it is a conversation, sometimes between more than two people, but it is a conversation, but I think it's a conversation with a difference, because it's a conversation in which one person is in control of the pace, the direction, the content, and that person's the interviewer. So it's a managed conversation, really. And in that sense as well, there's a power relationship. So it's always important to remember that the interviewer holds considerably more power than the interviewee. And that raises ethical issues that we might discuss later on in this conversation.
Yeah. So I suppose really everybody needs to think about what they're bringing to that conversation, don't they?
Yeah, I think what's important is that you're very transparent and explicit with the person that you're interviewing or the people, and you make it clear this is taking place rather than trying to pretend it's just a casual chat.
Yeah. So let's say I want to choose an interview. Are there different kinds of interview that I could carry out, different styles of interview?
There are a number of different styles of interview. People talk, for example, about semi-structured interviews, closed interviews, very open-ended. And I think what characterises these different interviews is the degree to which they're structured. So one way of thinking about this is the degree of structure. So at one extreme, you've got very structured interviews. For example, a market research interview where somebody's asking you questions on the street. They'll always be the same question, always asked in the same way, usually very short, very predictable questions. And at the other end, you've got what we call the open-ended interview, which is almost a kind of open conversation where we just chat, and there may be no specific questions at all. So that's one way of thinking about interviews along the continuum of structure.
And I suppose with those different kinds of interview, I'm imagining that the interviewer needs to have a different skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads us into another important consideration if you're thinking about undertaking interviews. So, for example, a very structured interview, like the market research example I've just mentioned, could be done by somebody with a limited amount of experience or expertise, because they just follow a script. Whereas an open-ended interview and also a semi-structured interview really requires a lot of experience and practice, because it requires things like active listening, being able to listen whilst you're watching somebody and making them feel at ease. So there are a lot of skill sets that good interviewers gain, and they gain it from experience.
And I suppose at that end of the spectrum as well, it's somebody who is the interviewer also needs to know their subject area quite well, because they need to maybe predict what some of the answers might be and be able to probe further and probe more deeply.
Yeah, absolutely, and something we might talk about later, but it's very important to trial the interview and then perhaps even to pilot the interview before you do the real thing. So we'll look at that a little bit later in the conversation. But you're right, it's not a straightforward method. People think interviewing is really easy. They've done some conversations before, but I think you need to think very carefully about the skill sets that are required to do it well.
Yeah. So how do I know if an interview is the right method? For example, is there a time when I would think, actually, no, probably an interview is not the right choice in this occasion?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think to some extent it depends on personal style and interest, but there are certain things or certain criteria you can ask yourself which will make it more likely that an interview is appropriate or inappropriate. So perhaps we could look at some of those criteria.
So you mean like a checklist or something?
Checklist, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So can you give me an example of something that might be on the checklist?
Well, let's start with the reasons for undertaking an interview, why you would undertake an interview. And I think there are a number of factors we'd need to consider. First of all, interviews are really good when there's only a small number of people involved, where the sample is limited. You're not really looking for what we call a representative large sample. It might be a few people, and you're going to be able to give them a lot of attention and spend a lot of time. So the size of a sample. Secondly, I think if you've got access to your interviewees, the people you're going to interview, it's easy to get hold of them, they perhaps work with you, an interview is ideal. But if they're dispersed, they might be in other parts of the world. Although you can use electronic technologies to do this, we can use things like video conferencing. On the whole, it's more difficult. So the more dispersed your sample, the less likely you are to interview them. The other factor that you might want to consider is the kind of questions you're going to ask. So going back to that example we talked about earlier with market research, generally speaking, market research are predictable closed questions, what we call closed questions. People are asked something, they're often given a list of choices, it's very easy to predict what they're going to answer. That is not a good time to employ an interview. However, if it's more open-ended, you want to delve into an issue, perhaps the issue might be sensitive, it might be something you would rather talk to people about, then an interview is ideal. And that's probably one of the factors that would make you decide to choose the interview format rather than, say, a questionnaire. There's another factor I think to remember as well. People often think they have to get what they refer to as a representative sample. And this comes from a kind of scientific paradigm of research where we're trying to make sure that our sample represents the population as a whole. Often with interviewing, that's not important. Often with interviewing, you're not really worried about whether it's an entirely representative sample. You're worried about the depth and the quality of what you're going to find out. So you might only interview 2 people. Now, it might be a school leader and a deputy leader, but they're really important for your particular investigation or case study. So I think it's important to think that interviews are great ways of collecting depth information when you're not really trying necessarily to interview everybody, but which would be clearly impossible.
And I suppose those kinds of interviews you've just talked about with a deputy head and a head teacher, if you're just conducting 2, actually those kinds of interviews might be the less structured and the more open-ended type of interviews.
Yes. I mean, again, it depends exactly what the research question is, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But because I think the question always dictates the method. But you'd probably be moving more towards that informal, open-ended end of the continuum that we talked about initially.
So is there anything else that I would need to consider when thinking about going about doing an interview?
I think one of the biggest things to remember is that interviews will eat up a lot of time because they're large. And even a 30-minute interview, which doesn't sound very long, is going to take you an awful long time to conduct, or actually to prepare for, conduct, and then analyse. So one thing is to think about the amount of resource you've got. If you're a single researcher, as many teachers are, you really need to keep the interview focused. You need to ask just the questions that are important. Otherwise, you'll end up with a lot of material that you have to do something with, possibly transcribe. And it's often estimated that transcription might take 10 times as much. So if you take 5 minutes to do an interview, it's going to take 50 minutes to transcribe it. And that's a lot of work and time.
Okay. So let's say I've gone ahead and I've decided, thinking about your considerations, I'll do an interview. I'm assuming there's a series of steps I need to go through. I mean, you talked about trialling it. Could you tell me what the steps would be? How would I go about it?
Well, I think the first step is to avoid going straight into the interview. A lot of people do is they think, I know what an interview is, I know what I'm going to ask the questions of, and they just interview. And that's often a fatal mistake because it's too late at that point to change or do anything else. So I think there are some preparatory steps that need to be undertaken to ensure that the interview achieves what you want to. We've said already that the interview and all the questions that you ask should be directed by your research question. So if we bear that in mind, you really need to think about trialling the interview and then piloting it. And what I mean by trialling it is devising questions, perhaps talking to people about questions, running them past a supervisor, for example. That's the very first stage of developing what we call an interview schedule. And once you've got those roughly right, the next stage would be to try and pilot it if you have time. And the difference between the trial and the pilot is that with the pilot, you're actually going to run it with a real interviewee. So you need somebody who will act as an interviewee for you, and you'd ask the actual questions you're going to ask when you do the real interview. And that's a really important stage before you actually undertake the interview itself.
And I suppose doing that, I'm reflecting what's working and what's not. But can I also ask the person I'm interviewing what they thought about it afterwards? Is that something you would do?
Yeah, it certainly is. I think reflection's a key ingredient or element in a successful interview. And it's also experience, which I mentioned earlier. So I'd recommend that if you're going to undertake interviews, you practice these interviews. Even if you're an experienced teacher who may have done lots of interviews with, for example, students or parents, I would still practice the interview, and I'd think of some way of recording that. And perhaps one good tip would be to get somebody to video the interview so that you can look back and you can analyse your own performance.
Yeah.
And when you're analysing the performance, you're quite right to point out it's reflection. I think there are two things to be thinking about. A lot of people will concentrate just on the content. Did I ask the right questions?
Yeah.
Did I get the information out of them I wanted? But actually, you also need to be concentrating on your skills as an interviewer. And I'm meaning there things like, for example, how do you listen? Are you what we might call an active listener? One of the mistakes that inexperienced or novice interviewers make frequently is they talk too much.
Right.
And secondly, they finish other people's sentences. So rather than let the interviewee speak, they're nervous, they perhaps want it to go well, and they rush in and they finish the sentence.
And I suppose the problem with that is that you're second guessing what people are saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's really quite important to develop that ability to pause. You know, sometimes a pause can be really powerful, not too long, but giving the person a chance to think and encouraging them to speak.
Yeah.
And in a good interview, when you analyse it, you should have said far less than the interviewee.
Yeah.
You know, if you work it out in percentage terms, yours should be right down, it might be 20%, the interviewee's doing 80% of the talking.
Yeah. So you've talked through those initial preparatory stages, and I've piloted it, I've got it in my head what I'm doing, I've reflected on it, and now I'm going to carry out the interviews. So are there some stages that I need to consider in the actual interview itself?
I think there are. Most good interviews, I think, fall into three clear stages.
Right.
They fall into what we might call the introductory activities, the warm-up, where you're putting your interviewee at ease.
Yeah.
They form into the central core, which is the main part of the interview. And then there's a section where we call it a closing of the interview, bringing it all to an end. So I think those three stages are important to remember, and there are particular things to look at in each of those stages.
So if we think of those stages, could you talk me through? Let's start with the first one. What would be in that introductory phase?
Well, this is a really important stage, which sometimes is ignored or people rush through it too quickly. And I think the introductory stage is essentially about making sure that the person you're interviewing feels at ease, is relaxed, and therefore is willing to talk to you and offer the information that you're trying to get out of them. So I think that's a stage where you need to be letting the interviewee know, for example, what are you going to do about confidentiality? What's going to happen to all the information that they pass on to you? How are you going to ensure it doesn't become public? Because that's something that people are really concerned about. They'll actually tell you an awful lot about themselves, quite private details, but they will want to be reassured that you're going to look after it, you're going to make sure that data's confidential. So I think you've got to talk about that. You've got to talk about the purpose of this as well. Why are you doing this? Now, you may have actually prepared them for that beforehand, perhaps in a letter, but it needs to be reiterated. What's the purpose of research that you're undertaking? What's the specific purpose of asking them questions? Why them, for example? And also, what will you do with it afterwards? So I think that's really important to clarify in this introductory section, particularly that last part. What will you do with the information? How will they get hold of it, for example? Will it be published? Will you send them a copy? And that's what I'd call the opening introductory element or section of the interview.
And actually sending them a copy or making that available is probably quite important for them to make sure they're happy with it, and also that your understanding of what took place is also the same as their understanding.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in a future video we'll probably talk about analysing the data. We'll not mention that here, but it's very important then when you're analysing the data that you check that what you think you've got is what they actually said. So that's an important stage.
Yeah. And so now should we talk about the second stage? You called it the sort of the main body of the interview.
Yeah, this is the core of the interview really, and this is where your questions and planning are going to play a really important part. So if you've trialled the interview and you thought carefully about your questions, there should be some kind of structure. And I think what's important in this part of the interview is that there is a narrative that you're leading. So although it might be, even in a really open-ended interview, you are steering the interview. You've got a certain point and certain places that you want to travel to, and you want to take the interviewer with the interviewee with you. So it's really important to have a clear idea in your mind. How long is that going to last? What are these questions? And another little tip as well that I find particularly useful is that when you're asking questions, if you can memorize those questions and internalize them, it's a lot better than trying to read them off a clipboard. I think that gives the impression that you're nervous yourself, and it makes a barrier between the interviewee and the interviewer. So to me, I try to avoid reading my questions, and that's why I don't make notes. I avoid making notes for the same reason, that I'm trying to keep eye contact with the person. So I record all my interviews, and again, that's a decision you need to think about. If you're going to record them, how do you do it? And letting people know that you're going to record them as well. I
mean, there's probably a lot of issues, and we can maybe talk about that in another sketch. But that'll be around how you hold the data. There's a lot of considerations about maintaining and controlling data.
There are, but going back to that core element, I think the other thing to remember there is that you do need to direct the conversation, and there is a tendency, particularly in open-ended conversations, to just let it wander. And this comes back to your research question again. If you know clearly why you're doing this interview, you should have a clear idea as to what you're trying to ask and what you're hoping to find out. And that's your role as the interviewer, to keep bringing the interviewee back on track if they start to wander, and making sure that what they're talking about is focused.
I suppose there's a balance between allowing them to give you the information that they want to give you, that they think is relevant, and you actually making sure that you're not carrying out the interview for hours and hours.
Exactly, because as we said earlier, the amount of data will be just voluminous, and you've got to transcribe it. But on the other hand, sometimes serendipity is a great asset in an interview, and occasionally you get these nuggets that people tell you something you didn't anticipate, and then it's worth pursuing. But that's a decision you've got to play by ear almost, and the more experienced, I think, interviewers will probably know when to follow a hunch and let somebody speak, and when it's time to cut them off and start moving on.
So we've talked about the beginning phase of the interview. We've talked about the core phase, the main body of the interview. You mentioned there's a third phase where you draw it all together. Is there anything you can tell me about that?
Well, again, I think it's a little bit like the introductory phase. Sometimes it's forgotten, it's ignored, and people just say, I've asked all my questions, I'm going to stop. I think you have a duty to your interviewee to summarise what's been said, perhaps to almost précis what they've said, and let them have that back. So you tell them what you think they've told you. You also need to tell them again when they'll be able to get access to this, what's going to happen next. Are you going to send them a transcript, for example, or will you ask them to check something? So you need to give them a timescale. And I think then you need to finish in a positive manner, and you need to thank them. Clearly, they've given... An interview is very transactional. They're giving you something, usually for free. So you need to respond in kind and show some gratitude for doing that, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. So let's say that I'm in an interview and I'm asking my questions, and I don't know, the conversation seems stilted, or I'm only getting sort of one-word answers, and it doesn't really seem to be flowing very well. Is there anything I can do about that?
Well, this is a very common problem, so it's something you really do need to be prepared for.
Right.
It happens to the most experienced interviewers. So I think there are two things you can do. One is you can have a series of prompts that are predetermined. You think about these beforehand. So you anticipate, I think, where people might stumble or where they might struggle with an answer. and you have some prompts. So you might ask them, could you say a little bit more about that? Or, and you remind them of some of maybe the content areas.
Yeah.
Those are what we'd call prompts, and they're prepared in advance. The second element that might help, but this is more difficult really, and these are probes. Okay. And I think probes differ because you need to initiate those without any preparation, because you've got to react to what people are saying, and you won't know that really until they say it. So this is why it's really important that you're listening and you're not making notes or writing something down or asking the question mechanically. You've really got to listen like an active conversation, and then be willing to, or prepared to, ask a more probing question. So for example, you might say, well, can you explain that to me in more detail? Or you might repeat what they've said. So you've told me about whatever, could you expand on that a little bit? And again, it's delicate because you don't want to put words in people's mouths. You don't want to finish their questions, but you do want to give them a little bit more of a probe and an opportunity to take something further. And I think that's important because people sometimes will cut themselves short. They'll give you a very short version of the answer when you want more detail.
I suppose repeating an answer back is actually good for many different reasons. It probably builds rapport, and it probably helps clarify understanding to make sure that what you think you've heard, you've actually heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So so what I'm hearing here, that kind of response. So what you're saying is, and then of course they get a chance to reply, and they might affirm what you're saying, or they might say, no, that's not what I'm saying. But they're all designed to go deeper into the subject. Right. And again, all this comes back to the same issue, I think, that runs right through the whole opportunity for undertaking interviews. And that is, you need to know what you're trying to find out. Yeah. You've got to have a plan for what you hope to explore, and therefore it's managed. And I think that's probably the most important element to emphasise about an interview. It might look open-ended, but actually really good interviews are very managed. They're very well structured.
And it's pretty much like everything we talk about in research, everything comes back to the research question.
It does, and I think we've emphasised that so often. You've got to be clear about that, because that will dictate the method, whether it's a structured interview, an open-ended, the kind of questions you ask. Yeah.